Welcome to the Triage Method Podcast Q&A edition with myself, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. How are you this week, buddy?
I am fantastic, Gary. How are you?
I'm excellent. Enjoying the absolutely fine weather.
This is positively delightful, Gary.
It's beautiful. Some of you might be able to see my lovely sun outfit. Enjoying the sun. Paddy's wearing a tap-out t-shirt because he just started the gym and he decided to get some gym clothes.
Because I'm a fucking savage.
Right. So
I've actually had this top since I was about 16, but anyway.
Yeah, I can imagine. So today what we're going to discuss is a question that we have received, and I know I've received multiple times from my own clients, off the back of a conversation that we had with Mr. Alan Flanagan a few weeks ago. So a few weeks ago we had Alan on the podcast to discuss the topic of chrononutrition, and there were a number of conclusions from that podcast and from the kind of research on chrononutrition in general that can lead people to think, oh no, I can't eat at night. That kind of would corroborate some of the old bro kind of advice to just no carbs after 6, that type of thing. Because basically, like, some of the conclusions in there were, look, in general, it's probably a better idea to eat more of your calories early on in the day. It's probably not very wise from a health perspective to eat most of your calories in the evening, and you don't want to be having big, high carb, high fat meals in the dark period, essentially. They were some of the kind of main conclusions that would prompt this question of, so should I not eat at night? And this is where you do need to kind of bring in a number of different considerations into the picture, okay? One of the things that's really key here is that a lot of my clients, they train in the evening, okay? So they train maybe, 7 p.m., 6 p.m., 7 p.m. So they could be having their post-workout meal at 8 p.m., 9 p.m. I remember last year, most of my jiu-jitsu sessions would have been in the evening, some of which mightn't have finished until maybe 9 p.m., 10 p.m. at times, depending on what.
Actually, I remember I used to do jiu-jitsu, and that was cool.
I know, that was
but then the corona destroyed our lives.
Yeah, it's an absolute nightmare. But yeah, basically, like, if you play any sport, GAA is the same. Some trainings can be 7 p.m., 8 p.m. So basically, in those contexts of us kind of active, healthy trainees, it is a slightly different consideration. And one would be encouraged to kind of generally still follow basic sports nutrition principles, because basically we don't have research on athletic populations as it relates to this question. And what you have to realize is that the vast majority of people are going to be not really active in the evening. They're not going to be active at all. They're going to be sitting down. And if you're consuming the vast majority of your calories, then where you've basically already got your baseline physiology making you less metabolically capable to handle all of that, and you've got the fact that you're sedentary, and you've got the fact that it's a big meal in general, a really carbohydrate and fat dense meal, all of those things kind of come together to make for an adverse metabolic response to those meals. However, when you're talking about exercise, what you have to realize is that your insulin sensitivity or your blood glucose uptake, your ability to regulate the nutrients that you're taking up, that's far superior in the context of exercise. So if you're someone that's engaging in resistance training or GAA or jiu-jitsu or whatever, you're now in a different situation to the individuals, that are going to be inactive in the evening. So as a result, we'd still say, go about trying to satisfy basic sports nutrition principles. So you want to have protein before and after your workouts for sure. You want to have carbohydrates before your workouts for sure, and then after your workouts you probably want to get some carbohydrates in as well in that meal, especially if it's the case that the next day you have another training session, especially if you have a training session in the morning. You might want to get those carbohydrates in a little bit sooner. So you're still going to want to satisfy those things, but what you mightn't do is say, I'm going to save all my calories for the evening time after my workout, especially if you're going to be going to bed very soon after. So that's kind of the first caveat. Would you agree with that, Paddy?
100%. And this is one of the things about like chrononutrition. Like, you can really, really, and I mean really, start diving in deep to this and being like, oh my God, everything has to be completely chrono matched, but it's unrealistic. To an extent, actual lifestyle you lead and the actual individual that you are. Because you can get really far down the rabbit hole and be like, oh, you know what? I actually have to take into account the chrono nutrition of milk. Was this cow milked in the morning when cortisol was maybe a little bit higher? Cortisol maybe could be translated through the milking process, and all of a sudden this milk that I'm drinking, it's chrono matched to a morning milk intake, and I'm drinking it in the evening, and all of a sudden, oh no, my chronotype, everything, I've ruined my entire life by having morning milked cows milk in the evening, and that's a bit more of a concern if you are, breastfeeding. Just I bring that up because this is the kind of stuff again that I research. But if you are breastfeeding and you express milk in the morning, that is actually chrono matched for the morning. Like it has higher levels of cortisol and wakefulness hormones. So if you are expressing milk and you are then going to be feeding that baby that milk that night, that can actually lead that baby to being more wakeful when you want that baby to be more sleepful and get a good night's sleep. Just as an aside. However, that's also a nice little trick that you can play on your significant other if you're like, oh, you know what? He actually hasn't been, pulling his weight, and I'm actually on a 2-day trip and I've just been, expressing some milk so that I can store it. I'm going to mark the milk that he has to give him in the evening as milk that I've expressed in the morning. So that baby's going to be awake all night, right? But anyway, that's just a complete aside, and you can really start diving down the rabbit hole with this stuff. But going back to the actual question at hand, you can genuinely go down the rabbit hole with this and then actually lose all sense of context to your actual life and reality, And ultimately, like Gary's going to touch on something else again now in a second, but ultimately, you just need to look at this and be like, right, with this chrononutrition stuff, it is in its infancy. The current research seems to suggest that, we shouldn't have the majority of our calories before bed, Maybe you could say in the future there's different chronotypes and maybe that'll affect people differently. But currently right now it's like just don't have the majority of your calories in the last few hours leading up to bed. However you put your calories throughout the rest of the day, there probably are differences, but ultimately it's not a huge consideration. So all you really have to go is like, am I portioning the majority of my calories before bed? We'll say the 4 hours, just arbitrary cutoff of 4 hours before bed. No, then you're pretty good.
Yeah, and ultimately, like you're always dealing with a significant kind of uncertainty when you're talking about like making very specific decisions with your nutrition, because some of these things are measurable for the individual. For example, one of the things that can happen that's like very readily identifiable is if you have a big meal before bed, sometimes you might find that you sleep really poorly. Your significant other tells you that you're sweating all night. You were kind of, your breathing maybe wasn't as good, and you woke up a couple of times during the night. You felt pretty shitty the next morning when you woke up. So if you're having symptoms or experiences that tell you that every time I eat a big meal before bed, I don't feel fantastic, maybe that's something to take into consideration. Similarly, if you're taking this stuff like hardcore and you're saying, right, I'm in a calorie deficit already, but now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop eating at 5 p.m. and you're now going to bed starving and you can barely sleep because of that, you're waking up in the night because of that, that's also not beneficial. So like what I always say to people is like, yeah, when you make these decisions, take feedback from the real world. Like what are you actually experiencing? But the other thing about that is that they're the things you can experience, that you can identify, but there's always going to be uncertainty here. And when we say uncertainty, you're not able to feel the change in plasma-free fatty acids or triglycerides, after a meal. Like you can't feel that stuff. But
you're not.
Well, I can, but others, they haven't attuned to that. They're not as quite as astute as. I'm very self-aware and mindful. I've trained it.
Of course, same thing.
But yeah, so there are always these background, physiological processes that you can't just feel and that you're not necessarily going to know are happening. So sometimes when making nutrition decisions, like when we say to you, it's probably wise to try and make or have more of your calories early on in the day. Like that's based on research that's measuring these different things in blood samples and stuff like that, and we're saying, okay, down the line, that could be associated with certain disease processes. There's always uncertainty that's going to be there, and for you, like, it mightn't have an effect, but for you it might have an effect. So ultimately you have to take this into your own mind and say, right, how much effort and micromanagement am I willing to put into my nutrition from a risk mitigation perspective? And for some people they might say, look, in my culture, we eat at 8 p.m. and, we get into it, we get stuck in. And I don't think that I'm willing to accept the trade-off of changing that. And that's fine. That's ultimately, up to you. It's your decision. But there is at least some case for us saying that, right, having most of your calories in the evening probably isn't a wise idea, especially if you are sedentary and you're not exercising during that time period. And even in the context of someone who exercises early on in the day, you would hope that it's somewhat auto-regulated, that you would have had all your or most of your energy intake early in the day anyway, because that's going to be supporting performance. So yeah, basically it probably is wisest to have most of it early on in the day. If you are having a meal in the evening, you could potentially just put certain things in place to say that, oh, it's a slightly higher protein and lower calorie meal. I'm not making it super dense in carbohydrates and fats, or at least you're doing that most of the time.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Again, just don't have the majority of your calories before bed. You can still have calories before bed. That's not an issue. And one of the things you will see people go like, oh, well, like you look at all these like warrior diet and like these people's, these hunter gatherers, they always have their feast at the end of the night and everything. It's like, yeah, cool. They're also eating that at like 7. They're like, stop using that to justify this huge binge on cereal and Twinkies that you're having at 11 or 12. Like this, it's not the same thing. They're literally eating like real whole food that they caught that day, and they spend 3-4 hours preparing it and cooking it up and everything, and they're eating it in a social environment. And you're like, yeah, man, I actually really love saving all my calories for the end of the day, and I basically have 300 grams of carbohydrates before bed. I'm like, it's just not the same thing, But anyway, just don't do stuff like that. You can still have some food before bed. Again, especially in the context of if you're training, it's a good idea. Again, if you are someone that's like, oh, I get a little bit of a craving before bed, that's perfectly fine. Have a little something. Just, again, don't leave the vast majority of your calories before bed. Portion it out throughout the day in a way that makes sense, that's contextualized for your situation. Again, maybe you're willing to take the trade-offs with health, and you're like, yeah, actually, some more of my calories at the end of the day, that's what I need, because I train fasted first thing in the morning, and I notice if I don't do that, I just don't feel as good with my training, and that's a trade-off you're willing to take, But again, it's all about just managing those trade-offs.
Yep, 100%. And it's also important not to think of, like, to always think of these decisions with their uncertainty and with it on a spectrum, because if you start to think of this purely in some sort of like a good bad dichotomy between early versus late eating, you're going to miss the bigger picture. Because what I've seen some people do as kind of a backlash to people who have been saying, eat more of your food early on in the day, is they'll say, look, I lost 100 pounds by intermittent fasting until the end of the day and eating all my calories then. But what we're not saying, or what nobody from the chrononutrition sphere would be saying, is that you cannot improve your health while eating most of your calories in the evening. You can still improve, but it depends on exactly where you are on that spectrum, So if you're someone that is at the position where, you're 400 pounds, you've never looked after your diet, of course, eating all your calories in the evening, if you reduce those calories and you're in a deficit, you're going to make massive leaps forward in your health. So that's also something that is worth keeping in mind, is that if for whatever reason, like I've had this with clients where the only way they can actually adhere to the process, or the way they find that they can adhere to the process, is that they eat most of their calories at dinner, then, absolutely. Like, I mean, I'm not going to tell you like not to do what works for you, because ultimately I view the risk of gradual weight gain and increasing body fatness and the development of obesity as being far more of a concern from my perspective than, whether you have 200 calories extra in the morning or evening, all things held equal. So do keep that in mind too.
100%. So to answer the question, yes, you can still eat before bed. You're not going to die. Your liver is not going to explode. Fatty acids are not just going to accumulate in your bloodstream and your eyeballs. You're all good. Just eat like a normal human. Keep this stuff in mind, and you'll be good to go. Yeah.
And just one final thing is that when we're talking about nutrition and as adverse effects on like the development of disease or whatever, you're always talking about a cumulative dose, cumulative exposure over time. It's a long-term thing. So if you're going, if you're going out tomorrow night and you're going for a meal and you're going for food at 9 p.m., don't just say to yourself, oh, actually, I'm not going to eat because chrononutrition. Like that's just silly. You know, these one-off instances or even like once per week, like these are not the things that really move the needle on your health. It's what you're doing on average over time. It's that cumulative exposure. So do always keep that in mind, because what I'm always mindful when discussing this stuff or discussing anything that significantly changes or puts additional restraints on how someone eats is how this could feed into people who do maybe have not necessarily an eating disorder, but some disordered eating behaviors, you know, so people who are already real restrictive on themselves. Do I want to tell someone that's listening that, oh, now you also can't eat in the evening? Like, probably not, you know. So you do have to keep that cumulative exposure in mind all the time, and don't allow these these kind of uncertain long-term things to affect your ability to go out, you know, once a week or once every 2 weeks for a meal, you know.
100%. Now, Gary, where can people sign up for more information, follow us, do all of that good stuff?
Yeah, so if like one of the things that we would like you to do at the moment is basically to pre-register your interest for the Coach's Corner. That's effectively going to be a membership site primarily targeted at personal trainers and interested trainees. So like by definition of listening to this podcast, if you listen to it regularly, I'd probably classify you as an interested trainee. You know, if you spend hours of your week, of your months listening to fitness podcasts, then you're probably an interested trainee. So basically what we're going to be doing on the Coach's Corner is taking, you know, deeper dives into how we actually apply all the stuff we discuss. So whether that be taking you through a training program, providing you with training templates, taking you through the different steps in a nutrition plan, you know, what do you do when you meet different fat loss barriers, things like how to improve sleep, but all of that basically layered on top of more like kind of more in depth or clear or walked through education that we'll also be providing. So if you're sick of kind of trying to read articles or just listen to podcasts and you want more, you know, visual stuff in the form of actual kind of lectures that we'll be developing, that's basically where we're going to be providing that type of education. So if you're interested in what we do, I think you'd probably be interested, and you can not sign up, but pre-register your interest for free below. You'll just go on a waiting list. You'll receive a significant discount prior to the actual launch, and there's no commitment involved in actually pre-registering your interest there.
100%. I have nothing else to say, Gary, except let's get out and enjoy the sun.
Yep, sun time. It's too easy.
Enjoy.